Okay, it looks like we are ready to get started. Um, Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andy Reese with Department on Disability Services. Um, I just have two quick announcements, and then we have one presentation for today's meeting. Um, First off, for people who have not seen the notices so far, on February 7th, the Statewide Independent Living Council, the DC Center for Independent Living, and Department on Disability Services is having their community forum and youth summit. It will be at the Washington Plaza Hotel at 10 Thomas Circle. That's from 8:30 to 4:30. And the purpose of that, the focus this year of the forum and summit will be on the state plan for independent living. It will be education about independent living, about the state plan, and we have already shared a copy of our draft state plan online so that people can see what is included in our current state plan for independent living, and get feedback before we submit a final approved state plan to Health and Human Services, the Administration for Community Living, at the end of February of 2025. In addition, we did receive notice of our performance hearing, which will be for Department on Disability Services, the Office of Disability Rights, and the Office of Deaf, Blind, and Hard of Hearing Services. And that will be on March the 3rd. It is scheduled from 9:30 to 5. So we'd encourage people to come out and talk about the performance of those two offices and one agency. So this month, we had a really packed agenda last month. This month, we are going to finish up what we had started at our last community forum, which is a presentation now about our comprehensive statewide needs assessment. I will share my screen, I hope. Okay, I'm guessing that people are looking at my screen, which says our DDS Rehabilitation Services Administration. So just to familiarize people, the vocational rehabilitation program is required every 3 years to do a statewide needs assessment. And that needs assessment is supposed to inform our state plan, our vocational rehabilitation state plan. In DC, when we do the assessment, we look at both VR and independent living services. We coordinate with the Statewide Independent Living Council and the DC SIL, as well as all of our network within the vocational rehabilitation space, in order to complete what is required. Our needs assessment was required to be completed in 2023. Unfortunately, it was a bit delayed. There were some challenges with completing it, with getting all of the, making sure that we had as full community input in this assessment as possible. And so it was completed in FY24. What that meant was when we completed our Unified Workforce Development State Plan, the VR portion could not in 2024 be informed by the needs assessment that was due to be completed that prior year. What that meant was that for one section of our vocational rehabilitation state plan, we will be amending our plan next July, based on reviewing the needs assessment, the recommendations that are made there. DDS, RSA will be working with our State Rehabilitation Council to look at our goals, objectives, and priorities based on what we've learned from the needs assessment. and we'll be revising as necessary that section of our state plan. And stay tuned for more information about that. We'll be working with them on developing a draft and then hearing from the community about whether we are really addressing all of the needs of the community in our provision of vocational rehabilitation services. So the comprehensive statewide needs assessment, the most recent time, was conducted, it was a joint effort by a local provider, ProMesa, and they worked along with the San Diego State University Interwork Institute. San Diego State has worked, both entities have worked with us in the past. I think this is the first time that they worked together on this. So they both have experience in conducting this needs assessment. And there we go. So the goals of the needs assessment. And these are established in the vocational rehabilitation federal regulations, and it's rather extensive. They have to look at 7 different areas, which includes overall agency performance, the needs of people with most significant disabilities, including the need for supported employment services, the needs of people with disabilities who are minorities, including looking at people who are in unserved or underserved communities, the needs of youth and students with disabilities, the needs of people with disabilities served through other statewide workforce development system components, the need to establish, develop, or improve community rehabilitation programs, which is essentially our provider network, and lastly, the needs of businesses and the effectiveness of the agency in serving employers. So what I'm going to go through today is the recommendations from each of these sections of the needs assessment. The full needs assessment is available on our website, all 193 pages of it. I'll include a link once I finish my presentation. I can only manage so many screens at once, but I will include a link to where you can find the full assessment online. All I am including here are the recommendations that came out of each section of this report. So as I said, the first section is about agency performance. And what we see here is just a little note. Since the passage of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, vocational rehabilitation now functions both on a program year and a fiscal year. The fiscal year is October 1 through September 30th. The program year is July 1 through June 30th. And so the performance data relates to performance year. And as I said, this was due in 2023, so it's a backward look at our performance. It looked at program year 20, 21, and 22. And what we see here are the total number of applications, which in program year 20 were at 1,450. In program year 22, they were down to 1,253. The percentage found eligible in program year 20, which could have been affected by COVID and people's ability to follow through, it was at 81%. In program year 22, it was up to 92%. The percentage of cases that were closed who were found eligible but closed before they developed an individual plan for employment was 1%. In other words, of people who were found eligible, 99% moved on to develop an IPE, an individual plan for employment. The employment rate at exit, which frankly is a little bit of a concern, this is a little low. In program year 20, that was at 38%. Understandable that it would have been low that year. Employment was challenging. It was the first year of COVID. It is at 44% in program year 22. Our expectation, so that is close to what one of our performance indicators with Department of Education is our employment rate 6 months after closure. And that rate is at about, I think the goal, and I don't have it in front of me, I should have thought of that before I started to talk here, but it's at about 45%. So we're close to that in terms of 6 months after. The challenge is, are all of the people that we see employed at closure staying employed 6 months later and 1 year later? So in section 1, under performance, some of the recommendations that came out of their report include that DCRSA should explore options to locate counselors in satellite or co-located offices to reach clients in all areas of DC. And I will just say, related to that, prior to COVID, we had 37 satellite offices, as it were. We had 37 partners in the community where we had VR counselors working. With COVID, obviously, that number went down to 0. And what has been a real challenge in the district is that even though in the district government, we came back into our office in 2021, the partnerships that we had in the community have not rebounded in that same manner. And so one of our goals in the coming year is really going to be looking at how we can get back up to where we were prior to COVID in terms of our co-locating in the community. Second, DCRSA is encouraged to create a training and staff development advisory group to inform the development and subsequent revisions to the new employee orientation process to ensure that it's comprehensive and designed to build initial capacity. And DCRSA is encouraged to develop a series of professional development training for VR staff and provider organizations to understand the broad needs of individuals with disabilities. I want to remind people, as I go through this and want to comment on each and every recommendation, I'm only going over the recommendations. The full 193-page report is available online, and we did provide it at the last meeting for people who may have read since then. I would encourage people to read the whole report to understand where some of these recommendations come from. Next, DCRSA is encouraged to review and revise communication protocols and expectations with counselors and establish performance standards that facilitate client relationships, which I expect is related to, you see our percentage of cases closed unsuccessfully is higher than we would like to see. And one of the primary reasons is loss of contact with the client. Next, DCRSA may consider a broad outreach campaign, including opportunities for all staff to engage in community events to build public trust in the agency. Next, DCRSA may consider initiating projects focusing on career pathways and emerging fields, for example, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, right? Is it math? I think it is. AI, artificial intelligence, and other such things that would offer new opportunities to DC residents with disabilities. Next, DCRSA is encouraged to formulate an internal task force focused on improving processes such as eligibility, referral, client participation, engagement, retention, and overall service delivery quality. The development of data sharing agreements should be considered. DCRSA should consider utilizing a more robust annual satisfaction survey to focus on understanding the root causes of challenges arising in the system, with solutions created to address those challenges. And last in this section, DCRSA should explore partnerships with other DC agencies to address housing, mental health, and other basic needs of people with disabilities. I just want to make a comment for people. I will address any questions or comments in the chat at the end of my presentation because I don't see them while I'm talking. I'm not ignoring them if they're there. The next section that they looked at was looking at people with the most significant disabilities and the need for supported employment services. So the recommendations in that section, DCRSA should consider introducing adaptive technologies and assistive devices tailored to people's individual needs. DCRSA should utilize the job accommodation network to provide job seekers, providers, and employers with accommodation options and best practices accessible to both job seekers and employers. DCRSA may consider improving the availability of supported employment and job coaching services and increasing the funding for supported employment programs. DCRSA may consider implementing a survey of providers to explore potential barriers to engaging as a supported employment vendor. DCRSA may consider extending the availability of these services to all disability communities with special programs tailored to the deaf and hard of hearing community. DCRSA should train staff to develop individualized employment plans that cater to each person's needs, preferences, and strengths. It should also implement regular reviews and updates to these plans to ensure that they remain relevant and practical. DCRSA should consider offering specialized training for counselors in mental health first aid and trauma-informed care. DCRSA may explore hiring or contracting mental health professionals to provide counseling and support directly within the DCRSA framework. DCRSA should consider using specialized providers with expertise in particular services, such as customized employment and individual placement and support. DCRSA should implement financial literacy programs that teach budgeting, saving, and money management skills and provide benefit counseling to help people understand and maximize public benefits while pursuing employment. And DCRSA should explore options to reduce caseload sizes by hiring more counselors, prioritizing individuals with complex needs, and investing in case management tools to free up counselor time for direct support. The next section relates to unserved and underserved populations in DC. And what they do first is just look at the overall population of various population groups in DC. DC has, what you can see here, the first two lines are a comparison between the District of Columbia and the United States in terms of the representation of people by race and ethnicity. And what you see here is that in DC, there's a lower percentage of people who are Hispanic or Latino than in the US generally. So in the US generally, it's at 19%, and in DC, about 12% of people. People who are white in the US generally, it's close to 58%, and in DC, it's at about 37%. Black or African American in the US generally is at 12%. And in DC is at just about 42%. American Indian and Alaskan Native is at 0.5% in the US and at 0.2% in DC. People who are Asian, 5.8% nationally, 4.1% in DC. Then Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islanders, 0.2 and 0.1%. Two or more races DC is about the same as the national number, which is 5% in DC and 4.3% nationally. What you do see is that these breakdowns by ward in DC vary quite a bit in terms of race and ethnicity, where you see a much higher concentration of people who are Hispanic, for example, in Ward 1, highest concentration of people who are white in Wards 3 and 6, highest concentration of Black and African American residents in Wards 7 and 8, as well as Ward 5. And the others are kind of too low to notice a real distinction by ward. These numbers, while we have seen some change over time in the demographics in DC, these numbers have remained pretty much consistent. So some of their recommendations related to unserved and underserved populations in DC. I mean, interestingly, I will say, we do focus on wards 5, 7, and 8, where there is a higher concentration of people who are African American. Because of that, what we see is close to 90% of the people supported by RSA are, so Black or African American people are overrepresented in the population of people who receive supports from RSA. But I think race alone doesn't explain people's needs for services or the need for us to do outreach to various different communities in the district in terms of accessibility to services, the need for supports for employment, it's income differences. So we have had in DC many efforts that we align with the workforce system in the district to focus on, especially wards 7 and 8, but there's recognition that wards 5, 7, and 8 are really the 3 wards where we need to focus more of our energy on employment supports for people in DC. There's also, I will say, been a great deal of work that's been done since maybe even 2 needs assessments ago to do much more outreach by the district, especially by DDS, for DDA as well as RSA, with the Latino community in DC, as well as beginning to do some better work now with the Ethiopian and Eritrean communities in DC. So their recommendations in this regard related to DCRSA is encouraged to enhance the environment and culture of inclusion within its internal staff and vendor community through a deliberate and embedded approach to cultural understanding and inclusion. This may include providing tailored and immersive training on cultural sensitivity and effective responsiveness. DCRSA is encouraged to use broad database decision-making to effectively improve outreach, employment, and training for underserved populations. Analyzing data and statistics to understand population-based service gaps should be incorporated into the agency's ongoing efforts. DCRSA should consider introducing efforts to engage more ASL interpreters to serve clients better and more effectively. This may include reaching out to businesses regarding inclusive interviewing and hiring practices. I apologize. I think the font on this slide is a little difficult to read for people who may be reading along. DCRSA should consider a broader community-based service delivery model by internal staff. This model should emphasize the importance of understanding and meeting clients where they are, that is, in their respective communities, and acknowledging and respecting their intersectional identities. DCRSA should continue to explore options to locate VR services with providers in satellite or co-located offices beyond the American Job Centers with Department of Employment Services, and also locate in other community cultural centers to ensure broad access. DCRSA may consider establishing new partnerships and building on current partnerships with community organizations not typically engaged with VR, but embedded in communities. For example, cultural centers, places of worship, foster care agencies, shelters, food banks, and community centers. These efforts could increase awareness of VR services and build trust within these underserved communities. DCRSA is encouraged to recruit and hire bilingual staff in alignment with the most spoken languages in DC to increase their communication ability with underserved populations. The next section that they looked at was services to youth and students in transition. And their recommendations regarding youth and students were DCRSA should implement a stronger monitoring and data collection process to become more focused on student growth and development. This system would allow DCRSA to understand trends in real time and develop plans for improvement with their partners in education and workforce to address transition gaps. DCRSA would benefit from reestablishing and nurturing relationships with charter and public schools and evaluating mechanisms for ensuring equitable access to services for students in charter schools. DCRSA is encouraged to formulate an outreach plan to educate and support transition staff in all schools in reaching youth and families, and to ensure that all students with disabilities have access to information about VR services. DCRSA should consider establishing a transition systems task force to work with education and other partners to understand the root causes of complexity, access, and equity issues and develop improvement ideas. I'm pausing. I'm going to stop myself. So I was just going to say that already exists. It's called the Secondary Transition Community of Practice. So we'll talk more about how all of these will be implemented later. DCRSA is encouraged to explore ways to increase and improve safe transportation options for youth with disabilities in DC. DCRSA might explore options with WMATA, the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, to identify available options and solutions for developing additional transportation resources to keep youth safe. The next section related to the statewide workforce development system, which would be the partnerships with the WIC and all the other entities that support that workforce system. And the recommendations there, DCRSA is encouraged to create and facilitate disability awareness training for Department of Employment Services staff. Other opportunities for cross-training staff in both systems could be explored, and collaboration could be built across systems. DCRSA is encouraged to increase the use of co-located or designated staff at each DOES office and vice versa whenever possible. Department of Employment Services should seek to broaden the use of effective collaborative practices highlighted by the Center for Advancing Policy on Employment for Youth and other national centers. An essential resource on advancing partnerships with WIOA Title I programs includes unlocking the potential of Title I. Title I is one of the programs administered by Department of Employment Services. In addition, DCRSA could work collaboratively with the Department of Employment Services to develop training to support the opportunity populations intended to be served by Title I. DCRSA, in partnership with the Department of Employment Services and Education, should explore opportunities to expand summer employment and work-based learning through program options outside of Title IV of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Title IV is, of course, the VR funding portion of WIOA. And they say such as titles 1 and 3. 1 and 3 are the titles that are funded at in the employment sector at the Department of Employment Services. The next section they look at is our provider network, which they refer to as community rehabilitation providers. And their recommendations here included DCRSA may consider holding regularly, for example, quarterly provider engagement meetings that would include DCRSA critical leadership, provider directors and staff to facilitate ongoing dialogue about emerging issues and opportunities for people with disabilities across DC. This could evolve into a community of practice among providers to advance competitive integrated employment across the district. DCRSA is encouraged to develop a small working group of providers and DCRSA staff to address the needs associated with the current funding model and the ability of providers to engage effectively. DCRSA may benefit from developing a network of additional providers to address the needs of people with disabilities from underserved communities. This activity may involve an environmental scan and analysis of some critical barriers and why some providers choose not to engage as DCRSA vendors. And the last section is the needs of businesses and the agency's effectiveness or the district's effectiveness in serving employers. And those recommendations include DCRSA may consider the development and implementation of a broad business outreach plan in partnership with the Department of Employment Services and other city systems. This outreach plan should include the opportunity to offer training on disability awareness, inclusion, and employment practices. DCRSA should enhance business relationships to encourage employers to utilize flexible work arrangements, such as remote work and flexible hours. DCRSA is encouraged to develop a working group to investigate the use of assistive technology, artificial intelligence, and other emerging technologies to strengthen its support of the business community in providing accommodations to people with disabilities. DCRSA should expand its work with the Regional ADA Center and national centers focused on employer practices to provide more significant resources to businesses operating within the city. DCRSA may consider partnering with other VR systems to develop a community of practice related to best practices and strategies for business engagement. And last, DCRSA may consider developing a labor market task force in partnership with the Department of Employment Services and key industry members in DC to develop a plan to support business in meeting these emerging needs. And now I'm trying to get to the place in this where I can stop share. Ah, there it is. So that was a great deal. And what I will say, as I said initially, there is the full report is on DDS's website. And let me just put in the chat exactly where you can find that. And I will say, I guess a couple of things. As I go through and read the recommendations, one of the things I think about them is on some of this, well, we're already doing that, which suggests to me, well, I guess we're not already doing that sufficiently effectively enough, because apparently some of the people in focus groups raised it as something that could be strengthened. And for that reason, we take this needs assessment, utilize that information, and begin with a conversation internally, then with our state rehab council, our staff, our providers, and the community so that we can develop a plan that is comprehensive, that addresses the areas that need to be addressed so that we can provide the most effective vocational rehabilitation services possible. I do not see any comments in the chat, but if people have comments or questions, please feel free to enter them there. I'm trying to find everyone in the list so that I can post the link here. There we go. So the link to the needs assessment is in the chat. And as I said, people can click on that. You can read the whole needs assessment. You can see where the information came from that informed these extensive recommendations. And as I said, our next steps are to be looking at this assessment, the recommendations that are made. We will be, and one very good piece of information in today's DC Register, finally, we did see posted from the mayor appointments for our State Rehabilitation Council. So we have a fully constituted State Rehabilitation Council, which I look forward to working with in order to turn these recommendations into plans for the subsequent 3 years of our unified workforce development plan in DC, which for the VR portion at any rate, which we will be amending, as I said, by July 1. I'm just scrolling through to see if there were any questions or comments that anyone had. I don't see any at this point. Sorry to overwhelm with so much information. The PowerPoint will be posted, if it's not already, I think it may be. The PowerPoint is on our website already, as well as the full needs assessment. And that was all that we had for today. So if no one else has anything to share, I will wish all of you a very nice weekend where we seem to be leaving the very most frigid cold behind. So looking forward to a relaxing weekend. If that's it from everyone, then have a great weekend, and we will see you all again next month.